Are empaths codependent? Are codependents empaths? What is the difference? I'd like to thank one of my viewers who posted this question on one of my recent videos, Am I an empath? And I think it's a great question. I think it's very useful to think about if you feel you might struggle with codependency, or if you feel like you might have a very high level of empathy and perhaps be an empath. And while I do think that these are very significantly different terms, there are traits that empaths have that could easily lead to codependency. And I think many codependents are empaths, and understanding how you can be empathetic without being codependent, super helpful for both. So, I'm going to talk today about where these terms came from, which underlies the significant difference between them. But then I'd also like to highlight some of the similar traits that people who are codependent or people who are empaths have. And really, the number one thing that blends the two, creating a codependent empath. There's one main thing. Hope I remember when I get to the end. No, I will. So I'll share that towards the end today. I actually think there is a significant difference between the term empath and the term codependent, but some empaths are codependent and some codependents are empaths. So let's talk about this. And I always like to start these types of discussions by saying that there is really no sort of official definition for either of these terms. And what do I mean by official? Like, there's not an official medical definition. The American Psychological Association has not defined either of these as a personality type. They're both terms that are used in popular culture, and there is now scientific research on codependency, which is pretty extensive. And there's beginning to be some research on empaths, but actually, there's actually more research going on right now about what is empathy anyway. Like, there's still a fair amount of confusion about what is empathy, why do we have it, where does it come from, right? So all of this stuff is being researched in the scientific community, which is pretty exciting, actually. Codependency has been around as a term for a longer period of time, so therefore there's more research on it, and it is a very well accepted term within the psychological community. Okay, just wanted to put that sort of caveat out there. So let me talk about the origin of these terms. So codependency began to be talked about pretty extensively in the US in the 1980s in terms of a person who was in relationship with somebody with an addiction. So codependent meant that that person was dependent on the person who had the addiction. And the traits that go with codependency are pervasively observed in families with alcoholism, gambling addictions, other addictions. Codependency also arises when a family is very, very focused on one family member's mental disorder or personality disorder or some major dysfunction. I've actually also seen codependent tendencies arise in a family where one person had a very serious medical issue. But originally, codependency was talked about in terms of the dynamic of primarily family members with somebody with an addiction. And then the term codependent began to be used much more widely, and it was very popularized by Melody Beattie's book in the 80s. And actually, what was observed by professionals who were helping people with addictions and their families is that if the person with the addiction recovered, got better, stopped using, the dynamic in the family would not always change, and the person who had the codependency would not always feel better, even though they were desperate for that person to stop abusing the alcohol or drugs or whatever substance they were abusing. When their partner or family member stopped, they weren't happier unless they did their own recovery. So the codependency began to be seen as really these personality traits that can impact that person in all relationships. So I'm going to go into the sort of signs and symptoms a little bit of codependency, But then the term empath grew out of a totally different environment and for a totally different purpose. And I talk about this in my video, Am I an Empath? But the term empath was actually first coined by a science fiction writer for people who have sort of a paranormal ability to sense other people's emotions. But it's actually become used now for a slice of our population who has very, very, very high empathy, which can be both a positive and a negative. It can cause particular problems in life if the empath has not yet done boundary work to differentiate self from other. And this is actually an area of overlap. So let me get a little more specific. So dictionary definitions of codependent describe the codependent as characterized by excessive emotional reliance on a partner, typically one who requires support for their illness or addiction. And a codependent relationship could be seen as one in which I can't be okay unless you're okay. My emotional state is dependent on you being okay. And very often it's a dynamic where the person who is in need because of their illness, addiction, mental illness needs the person who's the codependent, but the codependent needs to be needed. So that kind of underlies why researchers and counselors began to notice that when the person with the addiction would get better, it was not always good news for the codependent. The codependent wasn't always happy because they were no longer needed in the same way. So they lost their role. So the codependent could transfer all their energy away from that person towards somebody else because they were so rigidly attached to the role they had assumed, probably since childhood. So, in family theory around alcoholism in particular, other addictions, and then in general, dysfunctional families, do identify a rigidity of family roles where certain family members end up being the needy ones and other family members end up being the needed ones. And children in this environment may develop a sense of self-esteem from helping their family members, which in a regular situation could be fine, but in the extremity of a dysfunctional family could lead to an excessive reliance for their self esteem on helping others to the point where they forget themselves. So, codependents are often seen as people who will sacrifice their sense of self to stay in relationship with somebody and to focus on the other person's problems. Now, the definition of an empath, I talk about this a lot more in a video I have. I'll link at the end here called What is an Empath? But in general, that definition is not quite as refined and researched as the definition of a codependent. But in general, it's somebody who has an extremely high level of empathy, the ability to kind of know what somebody else is feeling, take on other people's emotions, something called emotional contagion, and often be very compassionate. So let me talk about the similarities between empaths and codependents, and then I'm going to talk about some of the differences, and then I'm going to tell you that one thing that causes there to be a lot of overlap, okay? So, similarities, I would say that codependents and empaths both have a high degree of emotional contagion. Now, I do have another video, I'm still working on it, on emotional contagion, and sometimes I don't know which one's going to be released first. If it's already released, I'll link it here. If it's not, come back and look for it. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification button, and you'll be notified when it comes out. But I do talk about the difference between empathy and emotional contagion. But basically, emotional contagion is a component of empathy. It's not empathy itself, but it is an element of it where we pick up on other people's emotions. And it's very well researched, and it has a wide differential in how much people experience it. But in general, codependents experience a high level of it, as do empaths. So, as I mentioned, that child growing up in the dysfunctional family might have learned to pick up on other people's emotions in order to try to calm the situation down or keep the alcoholic from using, or keep everybody in line so that somebody who has a horrible temper doesn't blow up, or cheer somebody up if they tend to get depressed, if they have a parent who gets really depressed and they want to cheer that person up. And these are survival based responses on the part of that child. But children in those situations, I kind of almost think of it as like octopus tentacles that like go out, and they learn to read the emotions of everybody in the room. And I actually think this is another similarity between codependents and empaths. Even though we don't have a lot of research on where an empath comes from or why, I actually think that many empaths come from traumatic situations or dysfunctional childhoods similar to codependence. So, for survival reasons, that child has developed these tentacles to go out and assess, is that person mad? Is that person depressed? What do I have to do? How do I help? And that's done for survival reasons, which means it gets very deeply embedded in the brain as a habitual pattern. So without therapy and work, recovery work, self-help work, whatever kind of work, 12-step work, right? The Al-Anon programs, CODA programs can be super helpful for this. But without that kind of recovery work, that habitual pattern may never change. And that person grows up with their focus on what other people are feeling to the extent that they may not even be aware of their own feelings. Now, why does this happen to one family member and not the other? Nobody really knows, right? There could be some biological innate personality traits that make one child grow up to be the one who is needy, or traits that make the helper child become the helper child, right? Because you will also have siblings who grow up within the same family system, one of whom becomes a codependent and the other becomes the addict. And then there are a couple of other typical roles, but that's a great topic for another video. So a similarity could also be where the ability to be highly empathetic comes from. And I do want to say here that I had another comment on a video that somebody was questioning that if it really comes from a childhood survival response, is it really empathy because it is self-interested? But actually, yes, it really is empathy, although not necessarily compassion. But again, good topic for another video. These topics are pretty complicated. But yes, it can be empathy, even if it began as a pattern of survival. That child had to learn to be empathetic to survive. So another similarity is that both empaths and codependents tend to go into the helping professions. And again, not 100%, not all the time, but there are a lot of people who become therapists or nurses, counselors, crisis workers, who grew up in these types of households. That was their role, and then they find work tied to that role. So that is also a similarity between empaths and codependents. You'll find a lot of them in the helping professions. So I'm going to talk about a key difference here, and then I want to go into that one thing that causes a lot of overlap. But I'd say a key difference is that codependency tends to be enacted in a primary relationship. Someone is often codependent with either their spouse, their partner, a sibling. It is a very important relationship, and that may be where all their focus is. A very clear example of this for me was a client I had who grew up with a brother who had significant mental illness and a number of learning disabilities. And his mother was totally focused on the brother. So the mother was totally codependent with the brother, and my client ended up being fairly ignored. So that was an example where the codependent person was codependent to one person, but not to everybody. She did not prioritize both of her children's needs over her own. She prioritized the needs of one child to the point where she basically had no life outside of caretaking for the brother, and the brother was never able to leave the house, live on his own, even though he had a pretty high IQ, and he actually probably, it's always hard to tell, but probably could have functioned outside of the household, but the mother could never let go. And then later in life, this created other difficulties and dynamics, which don't have to go into. But that would be an example of somebody who's codependent. It's usually targeted to one person in particular. And then, as I mentioned earlier, if that person gets better, the codependent might find somebody else who needs them. Whereas an empath is a little bit more of just a way of being in the world. Now, another trait of a codependent person is that they very often don't have any idea what they're feeling, right? And that is not necessarily required for somebody to be an empath, right? An empath might be able to pick up on other people's feelings, but they also know what they're feeling. Whereas a codependent person often cuts off their own feelings totally. So, this brings me to the one major thing that helps an empath not be codependent, and that's boundaries. If an empath has done their boundary work and understands where they end and where someone else begins, their empathic qualities can be a huge help in their life. If they remain confused and fused, actually is a good word for it. If we are fused with other people's emotional states, we then feel a responsibility to take care of them when we can't. So, in general, an empath who has not done boundary work is often codependent. You'll see all over the internet, people will say, well, empaths will take on broken people. Yes, if they haven't done their boundary work, they might attract people who really need help. Same with codependents, right? Empaths can burn out, they can hit exhaustion. So can codependents, right? Because without boundary work, an empath can confuse whose needs they're supposed to take care of, right? Same as a codependent. The codependent ignores their own needs to take care of the other person's needs. So their need is actually to take care of the other person's need, right? If an empath feels somebody else's struggles so strongly that they can't differentiate their own emotions separate from that, then they also will jump in and try to take charge of that other person's life or somehow get involved to fix the problem. So, for empaths and for codependents, some of the recovery work is very similar. The recovery work is understanding what are my responsibilities and what are the other person's responsibilities. When I get that emotional contagion feeling and I'm picking up somebody else's emotions. How can I stay separate, stay in my own emotional bubble while being caring and compassionate, but not feel like it's my responsibility to fix it? How do I develop the ability to understand that self care is really my responsibility towards myself and somebody else's responsibility towards themselves? So these are all boundary issues, basically, but boundary in a deep way, understanding really what connects us as humans, right? Because emotional contagion, empathy, compassion connect us, but also what separates us. And healthy boundaries do include empathy and compassion. We don't want to block that off. But how can we learn to have that and feel it without falling down the trap of getting totally losing ourselves? So, some really good resources here. I'm going to name a couple of different resources. I'll start with the one I offer, but I'm also going to share some others. I do have a program on boundaries very specifically targeted to people with high degrees of empathy, codependent tendencies, people pleasers. And we work on really the deep reasons, the very deep drivers for this behavior. And the integrative exercises in the program are really ways to experience a sense of our own emotional boundaries. So check that out in case you're interested. The link is here and the link will be below. Okay, another resource, and this is free and it's all over. If you are in relationship with somebody with an addiction, the 12-step programs, they're now offered online. They're in communities around the world. Al-Anon is specifically for people who are in relationship with somebody who has a problem with alcohol. Nar-Anon is a program for people who are in relationship with somebody who has got a problem with narcotics. There's an Anon program for gambling addiction. And there's also Codependents Anonymous. These 12-step programs, I truly think they are brilliant in their combination of really cognitive behavioral techniques combined with peer support. So they can be super helpful. And then, of course, therapy. So I no longer provide therapy. I am an affiliate of BetterHelp. I have a link that gives you 10% off your first month, but BetterHelp does provide therapy in 140 countries in 40 different languages. And I hear from people all the time right now that they don't have access to good mental health care. So BetterHelp or one of the similar organizations can be hugely helpful. Living a joyful life definitely requires healthy boundaries. And you can be an empath with healthy boundaries, which is awesome, an awesome place to be. And if you have codependent tendencies, you can recover. So I hope this video was helpful. Please let me know. As you can see, I respond to comments. If you support the work that I'm doing, please do give this a like and subscribe to my channel. It's a big help.